So it's a super exciting topic today. We're going to be exploring what Charles Darwin called the mystery of mysteries. That is, where do new species come from? How do new species originate? So we know that new species appear at different times throughout the fossil record in different aged strata. That clearly not all species were created at the same time. So, how do these new species come about? Where do they come from? How do new species actually arise? At the onset, recognize that the evolution of new species is a difficult concept for the human mind to comprehend, to grasp. For one, speciation, where one species splits into two distinct species, operates over millennia, over hundreds of thousands, over millions of years, across broad swaths of space, like you see here. And remember, humans were lucky to live 80, 90, maybe 100 years. So these vast swaths of deep time and space, they're tough for us to comprehend. Second, and maybe what may be more of an obstacle, our brains are evolved to put objects into discrete categories. We love to name things: apples and oranges, lions and tigers. But evolution is a continuous process across deep time and deep space where gene pools are going to separate and begin to drift apart and acquire new genetic mutations. Sometimes those gene pools remain far apart long enough for speciation to occur, but other times those gene pools may come back together again in both time and space. So, evolution is this continuous process of gene pools splitting and coming back together again. So, you're actually looking at speciation occurring in real time when you look at these salamanders. It's probably not apparent to you at first, but this is how speciation works. So, at the top here, you have the subspecies of Incentina salamander known as Picta. So, this represents the ancestral state. So, Picta is going to evolve into something like Oregonensis. It shares a common ancestor with Oregonensis, whose range is then going to drift southward until it hits the Central Valley of California, the Sac Valley, the Sacramento Valley, which is not hospitable habitat for salamanders. They can't really live there. So this gene pool is split by the Central Valley, and some Incentina salamanders are going to drift further southward along the coast and adapt to coastal conditions. Whereas other subspecies of Incentina salamanders are going to make their way into the high Sierra Nevada mountains. These are very different habitats with very different selection pressures. And over time, just as we would predict via evolutionary theory, these salamanders adapt to their new environments. So Xanthopicta right here, this is an interesting character. So this one is evolved to mimic a highly toxic newt, the California newt that lives on the coast. It even does the same behaviors as the newt. Okay, this is an example of Batesian mimicry, when a harmless species mimics a harmful species, and we'll come back to that. Whereas if you look at Platensis here and Croaketer, these guys become dappled. They're spotted. Why? Because they live in coniferous forests in the Sierra Nevada, and when the sunlight comes through the trees, it makes this dappled pattern on the forest floor. So this is a form of camouflage here in forests. But here's the really interesting part. When this ring species comes back together again, these two subspecies here on the bottom, and I'll probably butcher this name, it's Esclolitzi. When Esclolitzi and Clawberry, two subspecies of Incentina salamanders, in the places where their ranges overlap, right in here, even though they share the same geographic space, they no longer interbreed in the wild. Now, you can take these guys and you can put them in the lab, and when they have no other choice, they may mate with each other. But here's the crazy part. Their offspring are not viable. Very rarely do they survive development, and very rarely do they make it live long enough to become adults. Why? Because essentially this species is speciating into two genetically dissimilar species. We're witnessing speciation in action. So what drives speciation? It is reproductive isolation, some sort of barrier that blocks gene flow across two separate gene pools. In this case, it's the Central Valley of California that drives speciation in this particular instance. So that's my really quick down and dirty story about the amazing Incentina salamanders, a ring species. But I want you to take a moment now and check out the Deep Look video below and answer the questions. This stuff will show up on your next assessment, I promise.